Continue with our rolling coverage of the life of former Zimbabwean President Robert Mugabe. And joining us now on the line is MDC Alliance leader Nelson Chamisa. Mr. Chamisa, thanks very much indeed for joining us. Welcome to the program. Your thoughts on hearing the news this morning about the passing of what many have said was a towering figure in African politics?
Indeed, we are concerned and we note with sadness the passing on of Mr. Mugabe, our founding president. We have since sent our condolences to the Mugabe family, and we mourn with Zimbabweans and indeed the great part of Africa who are mourning at this particular time. As you know, in Africa, we always celebrate each other. In such circumstances, we seek to amplify more the positives than the negatives. As you know, Mr. Mugabe had differences with us. We had a number of disagreements over the decades on how he exercised his leadership, how he executed his governance mandate, issues to do with the economic mismanagement, and the breakdown of rule of law, as well as issues of human rights. So that is well articulated, and those differences will remain. But this is not a platform for politics. It is a platform for doing what is African, what is acceptable in our tradition and culture, to mourn with those who are mourning, and to mourn with the mourners.
So as a young man, what were your first memories of the president of the country?
Well, as a young man, as I was growing up in the 80s, we all looked up to Mugabe as an icon, as a champion of democracy, but more importantly, we had almost like excitement and happiness as a young nation around our education, around our health, our institutions, the jewel that we had inherited, particularly in terms of infrastructure and other such amenities. But clearly, as time progressed, we began to see a deterioration in that excitement, in that happiness, because freedoms were now being limited or eroded. People's liberties were now being jeopardized. Infrastructure was no longer sustaining the necessities and expectations of the people on account of mismanagement. So that brought us into more activism, greater participation, involvement and presence in politics and democratization in the student leadership days, together with Mr. Tsvangirai, my predecessor, who was a trade union leader. So we then came together to articulate an alternative to what Mr. Mugabe was putting across. He began to go neoliberal. He began to abandon the Pan-Africanist credentials, and of course we had to question him.
All right, so 2008, your party won the first round of those elections, and in the aftermath of that, you were brought into this government of national unity, and I guess this was the first time that you were up close with President Mugabe. Tell us about that time and his leadership style. What did you learn about Robert Mugabe during that period?
Well, quite a contradiction in what what we had known. We had known Mr. Mugabe on account of the deficit of good governance, deficit of leadership, but also issues to do with human rights, questionable credentials. And we had issues because we had been arrested. I, for one, had been arrested 16 times in the various prison cells and jails of Zimbabwe, where I was nearly assassinated at the airport in 2008 when I was traveling. So all those issues really were militating in perception against a positive view for Mr. Mugabe. But what shocked me when I got into cabinet was the chemistry, charisma, and charm that Mr. Mugabe would always exude and discharge at his ministers, myself being one of them, particularly those of us who were from the MDC side of the inclusive government. We were shocked to see that Mr. Mugabe was somehow a person with a human side All we knew was somebody who was heartless, cruel, and who had really given us a torrid and hard time. So that was a contradiction for some of us. It was also an eye-opener to understand how he would listen, how he would have a keen eye for ideas, for talent, for hard work, for industry. And he was easily moved by excellence. He was easily moved by, great ideas if you put them on the table. So that was almost like an eye-opener for some of us, and also a discovery somehow.
And I suppose many people will also remember his contribution to education. He himself, being a teacher, one hears stories about extra lessons that he would often hold with cabinet ministers during his time after hours.
Well, I'm not so sure about those in particular, but what I remember is that in all the encounters we had with Mr. Mugabe, you would always take a keen interest in knowing your personal space, how your family would be doing, almost things that ideally you would not expect a leader or a teammate to be concerned about. For us, that was somehow a different feel. But also, Mr. Mugabe was somebody who was moved by education. He loved education. He loved books, ideas. So he would be more interested if he had thoughts, if he had ideas. Those are issues that would move him. But that is the positive side. He also had his negatives, where the negatives are well articulated. The world is well aware of them. But I don't think it's good. It's a fair service for me as a young African to harp on the negatives, because that is not how we treat our elders, and that is not how we treat those who have departed.
Were you ever alone with him in conversation?
Indeed. I actually, now that you are asking, Peter, I remember the last conversation I had with him was during the inclusive government, when he called me because we had some clashes around the mandates of ministers. So he wanted to lecture me about security. And I remember that I was supposed to have a meeting with him and Prime Minister Tsvangirai. He told me one thing, that you must remember always that government is security and security is government. And I actually laughed and I said, look, I think you are mistaken. You can't just reduce the entire government to security. He said, no, you realize I'll give you 5 to 10 years. You will know that government is security and security is government. And I must say that I've realized over the years that security is a key component of government, and you can't talk of government without that key element. So those are some of the moments we shared. I remember also in Ethiopia when we went together with President Gaddafi, the late, and also in Geneva with President Kagame. We really had moments, and that's when I then discovered the other bit, when Mr. Mugabe, called me a supersonic minister. I was surprised that, for a moment, how would he, an opposite leader, call me and give me such nice names and give such accolades. That's Mr. Mugabe for you with his charm.
And of course, there was that surprise endorsement that you received just before the last elections.
Well, that one was a surprise. I was a bit shocked. I thought that it was going to cost me a vote because, there was a divided opinion. But I must say, I took it in a positive manner. I looked at it and said, look, our old generation, our elder statesmen, they are endorsing alternatives. They are endorsing us as a viable option for stability, for transformation, for democracy, for justice, but also for modernization of our country. So we took it as a positive, and we appreciate it, because between myself and Mr. Mnangagwa, Mr. Mugabe voted for me. So I'm more a user now in this situation, because I've lost a supporter, I've lost a voter, a person who chose to not be secret with their votes, but went public to say I will vote for Chamisa. And that endorsement is going to go for forever and ever. In fact, if you look back, Mr. Mugabe possibly voted for only 2 people in his lifetime, himself and possibly myself.
All right, so a little bit earlier on, I spoke to Dr. Nkosana Moyo, and he said that we shouldn't spend too much time trying to analyze the person, but perhaps draw lessons from his presidency, government, all of those issues in his lifetime. If we do that, what lessons can we learn about the time that he was president, the whole business of government, and that whole era?
Well, we must understand that we are created as human beings and not as angels. And in any case, politicians are not perfect. They have weaknesses, they have strengths. They have positives, they have negatives. They cause pains, but they also introduce some gains. And when we look at Mr. Mugabe, there are things that it gives us a salutary lesson. The first one is that leaders must lead and live. Leaders must serve and pass on the baton stick. In fact, one thing that I think Mr. Mugabe didn't manage well was leadership succession. Leaders must not successively succeed themselves. They must be able to leave their successors so that they are able to carry on the baton. Look, Mr. Mnangagwa is coming. He was not mentored as a successor. He was mentored as a follower. And I think that's why he's struggling. Even with the disputed mandate. You are aware that with the disputed election in July 2018, that continues to be a big issue. So we must learn from Mr. Mugabe that we must have successors. Number two, we must also be able to learn that we must build big institutions and focus on big ideas rather than big personalities or big individuals and big names. We don't want to rely on individuals, on politicians. Let's rely on institutions. I like South Africa because there's been an investment in institutions. That's the way it's supposed to be on the African continent. That's the second lesson. The third lesson is that it's important for leaders to also invest in their infrastructure. It's not a good thing that our former president was in a foreign hospital in Singapore. Our vice president is in China, General Chiwenga. Many leaders on the African continent are treated in Europe. We must have strong institutions, best hospitals, best schools, best malls, best supermarkets, world-class infrastructure, highways and motorways on the African continent so that we are able to treat our own, to take care of our own citizens, not just the leaders, but ordinary citizens. And I suppose that's the lesson Mr. Mugabe has taught us, and that is what we must be able to also focus on.
All right, so an end of an era, certainly. What comes next for Zimbabwe post-Mugabe?
Well, clearly, we have had our past, which is checkered. We are a divided nation. We are disunited. We have a legitimate crisis. We have issues of deficits in good governance, human rights abuses, humanitarian issues, things like Kukurahundi, Mrambatsina, wounds that have not been healed. We need to have an honest and frank conversation to move our country forward, have a national consensus on the nature of the crisis. Which crisis is a governance crisis, a legitimate crisis, a crisis of a disputed election. Then have open dialogue, credible dialogue across the board between ourselves and Mr. Mnangagwa so that we are able to have a transitional mechanism, comprehensive reforms, political, electoral, media reforms, so that we are able to set our country on a permanent path to legitimacy, to democracy, but also to sustainable democratization and developmental politics. That is the way we should go. Then we pave way for credible, free, and fair elections. That is the way forward. Then look at Mr. Mugabe as a lesson, because there are misses, omissions, commissions that are supposed to be our basis for correcting past mistakes, righting the wrongs that have been committed, and also make sure that we remedy the damaged and destroyed past.
Mr. Chamisa, thanks very much indeed for your time. That was Nelson Chamisa, who's the current president of the MDC Alliance, the opposition party in Zimbabwe. We're going to take a quick break, and when we